Bonjour mesdames et messieurs, c'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir à Harvard ce matin pour cet événement, une conversation entre Monsieur le ministre Jean-Yves Drian et l'ancien secrétaire à la Défense Ash Carter. Cet événement était co-sponsorisé avec le Centre Belfer et le projet sur l'Europe et les relations transatlantiques. Je vais prendre juste quelques minutes pour expliquer le format de notre programme aujourd'hui. D'abord, Monsieur le ministre prendra la parole et ensuite il y aura une conversation entre Monsieur le ministre et Monsieur le secrétaire. Et à la fin, Monsieur le ministre prendra les questions du public. Si vous avez une question, vous allez trouver les microphones au fond de la pièce et nous demandons que vous vous installez devant le micro et de garder vos questions prêtes pour que plusieurs gens puissent parler. Veuillez désactiver vos téléphones portables avant de commencer et je vous remercie encore d'avoir été parmi nous aujourd'hui. So I hope everyone got that because there's totally going to be a quiz after for the English speakers. But just wanted to say thank you for coming today. My name is Julie Crowley and I'm a student at Harvard Kennedy. Just a couple quick words about the format for today. This event, which is a conversation between the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, and the former Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, is co-sponsored by the Belfer Center and the Project on Europe and Transatlantic Relations. We will start with a few words from the minister, and then a conversation between the minister and the secretary, and then finally a Q&A session with the minister. And at this point, you'll find some microphones in the center of the room, and we just ask that you move in front of the microphones when you have a question, and to keep your questions brief so more folks can have a chance to ask questions. And then before we start, just please mute your cell phones, and thank you again for joining us here today. And also, there will be a translation in English with the headsets that you were provided. And please just remember to drop those headsets off with our staff when you exit. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We are starting slightly early. The minister has a very tight schedule, so you may see some people coming in and out here in the front row. One of them, if his flight was on time, Jean-Yves, is Ehud Barak, who happens to be here, who may be sitting over there shortly, if you remember him from your time as defense minister. It's my great pleasure, personal and professional, to host and introduce Jean-Yves Le Drian, the foreign minister of France. And also Ambassador Arrault, a long-standing pillar of Washington, and the French foreign ministry. He tells me he'll be departing that job soon. But Jean-Yves, who was my fellow defense minister, got promoted. Although I just told him that I always thought defense was a better job. But in the French system, that's a promotion and a great credit to him, because he was held over by President Macron after being initially appointed by President Hollande. And that is a tribute to his talents and also to the breadth of the French political establishment's ability to recognize talent across different elected administrations. So there are a couple good lessons in them. But one big lesson about this man, and I would say something about him. First of all, he's got a very distinguished history. He hails from the western seaport of Lorient, which is a beautiful place. I was saying this is a beautiful seaside city too, but Lorient's pretty nice. And he rose to positions at a very young age. So he spent his whole life, pay attention to this, students, in public service. succeeded in that, became essentially the governor of the entire region, served there for a long time, in and out of Paris in ministerial positions, then to the important job of defense secretary, where he and I spent a lot of time together, more about that in a moment, and then I left, and Jean-Yves shortly thereafter became the foreign minister of France. This guy has a lot of things going for him, but he is a thinker. He was, as we tried to work through important issues, one of the people that I could talk to who had big strategic ideas and the ability to translate them into practical plans for us. Not everybody has that. Jean-Yves does. He's written a marvelous book called Who is the Enemy? Little book, and I commend it to your attention. There is an English translation of it that is, to me, the most trenchant and wise thing there is on Islamist extremism and the meaning of it. And it was a very important book to be able to read when ISIS was running amok, something that Jean-Yves and I want to say something more about that shortly, dealt with together. So he's a strategic thinker, he's a doer. He's a doer, and this was really important to me. This is a guy I could do stuff with. And the one that I have two pictures up here, Jean-Yves, that you'll remember very well, to illustrate is the war on ISIS. These guys had to go. They were killing our people in Paris and in cities in the United States, and you can't have that. And they were barbaric, and we were defense ministers. We were supposed to defend our people, and you can't have that nonsense. So they had to be destroyed. And we needed to put together both a plan and the capability together to do that. And so Jean-Yves and I began meeting in 2015. We eventually congregated all of the defense ministers of the group of countries we were trying to put together. They mostly were the key European allies. I would like to tell you that other countries had the good sense to contribute further afield, but they didn't always. And our stalwart friends in Europe who saw the same civilization at risk joined us, and we met with a bunch of friends of ours again and again and again. And the picture that resulted in, Jean-Yves, I don't know that you can see this, but it's the two red arrows.
Si, je le vois là. Je le vois là.
Ah, okay. It's the two, what we used to call the two red arrows. Now everybody needs a picture. And that was our picture that told our population what we're doing. And it's like one of those World War II things. You need to go where you're going. Where's the war? Where's the victory? And that's Mosul in the upper right in Iraq. And that is Raqqa on the left. Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, had to be taken. Raqqa was the so-called capital of the so-called caliphate. And so for symbolic reasons, to show that there cannot be a state based upon this ideology, it had to be taken. And so two different and complex countries, two different campaigns. Watch that little dot there in the lower left there called Chiara West. I'll come back to that in a minute. So by the end of 2015, shortly after those terrible attacks in Paris, when Jean-Yves and I were together in Paris, and I later was on the Charles de Gaulle, the French aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean that was participating in the air campaign. By that time, we had completed the plan. We were underway, and we completed the plan that would culminate in the defeat of ISIS in Mosul and Raqqa. Now, that picture over there is a year later. And a year later, so this is 2016, fall of 2016, that picture is at Kiara West. We've taken Kiara West. It is the main staging base for the envelopment and capture of Mosul, which occurred a few months later, and those are French guns at Kiara West. And I arrived a few days after we took Kiara West and was visiting with French forces. There were only French forces, US forces, and Iraqi special forces there. And right up the street was the war. And I took this picture and others, and I sent it back to Jean-Yves, and I said, that's a friend in need. So anybody who doesn't think that our allies do anything for us, take a look at that picture. Another one that I'm very proud of that I have to say the United States played a minor role in, and France a major role, was Mali. Similar phenomenon. And I need to tell you, and I'm going to ask you, Jean-Yves, about this a little later, France, on behalf of the Western community, is the leading nation in Africa. We count on them. We follow them in the main. They carry most of the load. So when the French were operating in Mali, for example, our role was mostly to refuel their aircraft so that they could keep them going at a fast rate from France to Mali. And the last thing I'll say is that at NATO, where we work together closely, Jean-Yves was an important partner in putting together NATO's response to Russia's aggression in Crimea, in Syria, on cyber, and in nuclear weapons matters and so forth. So we did a lot together, and I was very grateful to have him. There's no stronger, wiser friend than this guy. Personally, we were in the same foxhole for a long time, and people say to me, what do you miss most? Do you miss Washington? They asked me. I said, no, I don't miss Washington. Here's what I miss. I miss the troops, and I miss my partners. You come from different countries, you have different responsibilities, you're answerable to different people, but you have to trust one another and depend on one another. And I miss my friends like Jean-Yves, the troops, and people like him. That's what I miss. Our wives became good friends, and Stephanie would be here, but her flight's delayed. Mariah can't be here because Jean-Yves had to go through Africa and couldn't do it. But I think there's a reason why we work together so well personally and why we work together so well as countries, and that is that we share something, and that's the values of the Enlightenment that France brought us when they first helped us birth this country centuries ago, and kind of remain our oldest friend. So it's a pretty good deal to have friends like France, and it's a very good deal for me personally to have a friend like Jean-Yves. And in my personal opinion, it's not my right to say this, France is really lucky to have had him as defense minister and to have him as foreign minister now. He's now a diplomat, and he is going to address us on the question of diplomacy, about which we have a lot of important research going on here, and what we think is an important part of international life. Then I'm going to ask him a few questions. Then I'm going to throw it open for questions for you. And we need to keep the minister on time because he goes on to several other things, as foreign ministers tend to do today. So take a look at those pictures. Take a look at this man. Those pictures wouldn't be there without Jean-Yves.
Faut pas exagérer. Oh, you're exaggerating.
Merci H de ces mots aussi chaleureux.
Thank you, Ash, for those very kind words. And
Merci de cette
thank you for this friendship.
Merci aussi de
We were accomplices, and thank you for everything we did
quand
together.
je regarde cette carte,
When I look at this map,
je pense beaucoup à
I
Raqqa.
think of
Toi,
Raqqa.
tu penses d'abord à
You
Kayareb,
think
moi, je pense
Kayareb, but I think more of Raqqa, and that's normal.
puisque comme tu l'as dit,
As you said,
Raqqa était le
Raqqa
creuset
um,
de toutes les initiatives terroristes.
was the base of all the terrorist initiatives that France suffered, in particular in 2013, and it's from Raqqa that everything was organized, with also
Les combattants
some combatants, French combatants that had joined the terrorists.
et nous avions
And we
comme
had
principale préoccupation,
our main preoccupation was to really touch Raqqa.
je le concevais bien,
Even if I understood this well, it wasn't on a military basis. Strategically, it was one of the most important issue. That wasn't. Mosul was.
et
And Iran
la France est rentrée dans la
and
coalition.
France joined the coalition.
Nous avons beaucoup travaillé ensemble.
We worked together very closely, and I had that preoccupation, that concern symbolically, that I wanted to destroy Raqqa. Because for the French public opinion, that's where the terrorists started. And so we had to engage in this battle as well as the Mosul battle. And so we had discussions on that. You know, we have to act on both together, Raqqa and Mosul. And it's thanks to Ash that that point of view was respected, and it was a very important element. And now Raqqa, you know, wasn't retaken by Bashar al-Assad. It's always in this part of Syria. That is, I think, in a complicated period that exists now in Syria, it's kind of a lever. That wasn't the reason. We didn't want a lever. That's not why we went to Raqqa, but it kind of became that, and I'm very happy about that outcome. And I answered Ash's answer to come here. I said yes right away. It's an honor to speak here. And it's also a pleasure and very emotional to meet with Ash again here. I haven't seen him in 2 years, I believe. So to meet him here in his with his new title. So I would like to talk about diplomacy, at least as an introduction to my speech. It's a bit like a question that can be provocative. Is diplomacy alive or dead? In other words, do we still have collectively the capacity to develop cooperation between countries and to have collectively the possibility of having an approach that is shared to avoid wars and obtain the common good? Since our last meeting, 2 years ago, I can say that the world on these questions has radically changed. It's not that our diplomacy would not have any solution for these threats, but our democracy is itself under threat, being threatened. The standards, the institutions on which our diplomatic action were supported, they're fragile now, and the erosion of the diplomatic dialogue that's being eroded. And so it's legitimate to ask ourselves: is diplomacy, in the conception that we have of it, in the idea that we have of it, is it able to play its role of a stabilization force? And I would like to give you a few of my thoughts on this. President Macron at the United Nations a few days ago said clearly that we don't want that the United Nations know the same faith as the previous organizations. So it's following a great ideal, but it doesn't grasp the realities, and so it can only offer its lack of power, because certain states, some of the most important think that it's no longer has its importance. So this evolution, it's a risk that we must look at. And in today's environment, there are three traits that I find are important. Is that we see the power logic that is coming back brutally, and we're no longer used to that. Some people don't hesitate to use intimidation, confrontation in Eastern Europe and in China, in the seas. We see those issues. And the second thing, which relates to the first issue, is that the international concept where each country has a voice, it's no longer a guiding principle internationally, but rather an idea that is sent back to the instruments of history. And thirdly, what I observe is that the transatlantic axis, which is since 1945 is a reference, but it's there's now the unilateralism temptation in the U.S. that can have us go into a world that doesn't have any benchmarks. And in that context, we must protect our citizens by facing the international crisis: Syria, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Sahel. There are many of them. We have to protect our citizens, but also answer the crisis on the international sphere. And that is a very direct threat. We have to name it. It's an enterprise of deconstruction of the multilateralism such as we have conceived it at the end of the Second World War. And what is multilateralism? There are rules and institutions that all of the countries in the world, based on legal equality, have organized themselves to live together. And this is based on cooperation, but not confrontation. And in the last years, we have seen that this is the only way to elaborate a common approach that will be first based on facts, shared facts, identified facts. The multilateralism is this ideal that became a reality to allow during the Second World War and after, to build an order of peace and prosperity. And today, it's the best way to fight against the nightmare of a world where salvage competition and pure force would be the rule in international relation. And this is what we're seeing today. This is what could all disappear tomorrow. And I also observe in this deregulation some fundamental principles that are progressively being abandoned. First of all, the basic rule of the non-respect of the word that is given by a country that is slowly disappearing. And I have a lot of examples, and not only in the U.S. Some countries also will use the defiance of facts and disinformation and lies to present, to act in inadmissible ways, and they paralyze the Security Council's action. Others pretend to play the game of multilateralism, but they're really trying to impose a type of multilateralism that is alternative and centered on the strongest player. And others, they are openly opposed to the multilateralism. I say it here, and President Macron said it at the General Assembly. It's this temptation of certain members of the U.S. administration, and it's a major risk for the country as well as for the U.S. And if I'm talking to you about this, and if I wanted to mention it in my introduction here, it's because for me, multilateralism, it's more than a heritage. that we must honor. It's the key to our future. I think, of course, of the crises in terms of security that need a shared approach, but also the world challenges. Without international cooperation, we can't master those challenges. And at the same time, we can't deny the urgency of those challenges: climate, cyber, trade, migration, immigration. In all of that, there's no hidden passengers. We have to be engaged in rethinking multilateralism. And France is really engaged in that in order to learn from the last decades and from the world evolution as well. Essentially, ensure that there is a multilateralism that is strong. And it's because our country has a certain ancient influence and a presence at the Security Council that we must be at the table. And I think that President Macron's speech in last April was very important. So which initiatives can we take to really start this important work? First of all, we have to reinforce and improve how big international organizations work today and not miss their importance. Everybody can see this, whether it's the UN, but also the International Trade Organization. We know what problems they have, but we just have to transform them. And simple transformation won't be sufficient. The type of multilateralism that we want must be flexible, imaginative, and we must be concerned about having adapted solutions to our problems. And that's the reason why we take such initiatives like we did by launching the International Partnership Against the Use of Chemical Weapons with the G5 Sahel in Africa, with the Solar Alliance, those types of initiatives. We need more and more of them, and to regroup the countries that want to work with that, in that type of cooperation, and also to associate not only the countries but the civil enterprises and other such organizations. That's why we had the success in the COP21 of which came out the Paris Accord, and this will also help with the peace efforts November 11, with all of the players from the international governance to push these projects and propose solutions to the big challenges of the world: biodiversity, immigration, artificial intelligence, and other big issues. That's the second point I wanted to make. And the first one is just to renovate and then to initiate new formats. And then finally, the third point, we must try to have an alliance with what I call for now the goodwill powers. That's how I like to call them. Countries like India, Australia, Japan, Canada, Mexico, just to name a few, who are powerful democracies, but they are also very attached to multilateralism, with a very strong sense of having to recreate it. So let's try to create with them a collective action to really weigh, to initiate, and to suggest solutions. And within those goodwill powers, the European Union is very important. It's my conviction. When we talk with a lot of other big powers, France is only sovereign if it's fully European. And President Macron wanted Europe to be at the heart of our agenda, and also because Europe itself is at the crossroads. Our continent got used to living in peace, prosperity, freedom. It's the best sign of the result our founding fathers' project. But this habit has brought some of us to forget what we owe the European Union. And some people are started to point that it's the enemy of the people, but in reality it brings people together. And so we can't let this misunderstanding last. We have to face this. We don't have an alternative option. We have to rebuild Europe so that it's more sovereign, united, and democratic. And that's the message that was given by President Macron. It's not an easy road, but it has never been easy in Europe. Europe must face critics that often don't agree within amongst themselves, the populations in the continent. But I am convinced that our message will be heard for a Europe that protects, that debates, that takes matters into its own hands. That is becoming more and more concrete. There are steps that have been reached to settle these problems. And it's not only in Europe that we need this. We need to respect international order. This could be one of the pillars of this recreation of the multilateralism that I've been talking about. Perhaps you'll ask me if the U.S. can be part of this group of goodwill powers, and I will say without hesitation that yes, of course, they have their role to play in there. In order to rethink and remake multilateralism. This is essentially what I wanted to mention to you about diplomacy that is in crisis, that is asking itself where it's at, and that has great challenges ahead of it. We wrote together great history, France and the U.S. We share values. We are partners in arms. We have profound links, and this friendship will allow us to overcome some of the challenges that we have now and differences in opinion. Thank you very much.
Okay, Jean-Yves, thank you very, very much. That's the kind of thinking that is typical of Jean-Yves Le Drian. So Jean-Yves, I've got a few questions for you, and I'm not going to start provincially.
Je vais laisser celui-là. Okay.
And I'm not going to start provincially with us here in the United States. That may seem contrary to the American way. Not to talk about ourselves first, but I noted that we're not automatically in the list of goodwill powers, and I hope we get there. I do have to thank you for giving our president such a nice parade. You see, we don't give our presidents parades. We give our veterans parades on Veterans Day, and we give our fallen dead from war parade on Memorial Day, and we give our flag a parade on the 4th of July, but we don't give our president a parade. And so I'm grateful that you did. Let me start with there is the European Union. There are these key institutions. There is NATO. There was, can you still hear me, the trans-channel relationship, now endangered through Brexit. You have some political uncertainty, I would say, in the other of the great European powers, namely Germany. And so it does seem to me that a great weight rests upon France at this particular moment, perhaps passing one in European history, to represent the European idea. And I'd like to draw you out a little bit on that and how you, as France, help to preserve that part of the key community, given that many of your goodwill partners were non-European. So let's start with the European Union and Brexit, and then maybe go to NATO. What's the way forward for both of those?
As far as Europe is concerned, for me there's a double paradox. The first one is that the Europeans and also the commentators consider that Europe is in bad shape. It's not going forward. It's in crisis. And it's true. It's asking questions about its destiny. It probably doesn't dare herself show its own power. Or she doesn't think, Europe doesn't think of itself as being powerful. And during that time, during the year that, the past 2 years even, never Europe has progressed so much, at least in the last 2 decades, but in ways that are very discreet, I would say. So I gave 2 examples before that you know well, and I think they mean something to you and to the rest of the people here. We could have thought that with the custom measures that were imposed by the U.S. Concerning the trade, transatlantic trade issues, Europe could have fractured itself and have shared different opinions. But it's because Europe is determined and showed its shared determination that your administration decided to open up a round of trade discussions, and everybody was there. And so on such an important issue, and I don't know if it's a confrontation with the U.S. or a strong discussion, let's say, you can choose the word you want, but facing such an important issue, Europe showed its strength. While people think that it's weak, and its strength continues because those discussions are ongoing. And at the same time, Europe, at the Gothenburg summit, gave itself social rights as a basis for the countries that form it. So it's a subject that a few years ago was perhaps impossible to think of, but it's been done now. And thirdly, we can talk about it with NATO, but it's interesting. Europe is now talking about its strategic autonomy. She is talking herself about her strategic autonomy, which is not opposed to the U.S. or the Atlantic Alliance, but it says I must ensure myself my own autonomy. I must master my own security. Like when I started at Defense Minister in 2012-13, that type of conversation you couldn't be spoken about. And collectively, Europe then decided to have its own budget to finance the defense of Europe. Not just each country for its own defense, but collectively. Now Europe says, okay, I have to invest in my own collective defense to ensure the interoperability of my forces and initiatives in terms of innovation, anticipation of armament and security for tomorrow, and so on. So I'm talking very freely here. To me, it's a paradox, because while Europe is doing all of this, subjects that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago, including immigration, because those positions are still not all in place. They require preparation and agility, but the principles of immigration in Europe were adopted commonly at the end of June. And at the same time, there's an emergence of the populations who consider that they are victims of globalization without rules, and so we don't see that reality. And Europe that is protecting a powerful Europe, unified Europe, it's already starting, it's already readapting. That's the first paradox. The second one, so this first paradox is that you say to European people, you're stronger than you think, you're going faster than you think. But we don't know how to say this. We don't know how to really take this and make it a reality. And the second paradox, it's that those people in Europe who are trying to develop an alternative based on national populism. I'm thinking of Hungary, for example, but Italy as well. They are rapidly facing the impossibility of agreeing together on what this alternative should be. And then you say to people, we'll find solutions to find this alternative to what you're living now, what you think you're living, but in reality they are pushing lack of rule of law. And a third aspect, it's the demonstration of the second paradox, is that Britain used to think that the future was outside of Europe, that there would be better options outside of Europe, and now they're realizing as they progress, that the Brexit was maybe not a good idea for the UK. And I think that evolution is going to continue in the following weeks. That's what I wanted to say in summary. So the European elections will happen in next May, and it will probably be the opportunity to have a certain cohesion, to have a unified message to the public opinion, to what I just said now, in order to go over those two paradoxes and have a sovereign Europe that is not afraid of itself. And indirectly, I can say it here, even if what I said is being reported, but Trump can help us in this necessity. And this necessity shows how important the role of France is at a time when there's a certain political questioning that's going on in Germany, when the UK is trying to follow its own road, and Italy had some of the orientations that we know. So it's making us more responsible, and the role of France is essential.
sur
Now,
le temps.
Jean-Yves, I
Oui.
know, just let me pull on that string a little bit, particularly with respect to staying on Europe for a moment, Jean-Yves, and on Brexit. So those negotiations are ongoing. I realize that it is partly a strategic matter, but also very importantly an economic matter, so that you share responsibilities with other parts of the government and the EU. How has it affected France on the economic side? So I saw lots of companies leaving the city in London and taking up headquarters in Paris. And to some extent that has subsided, but it was certainly a trend for a while. So looked at from the point of view of France, and regretting it as we may on behalf of the British, in that sense at least, it had some short-term advantages. And secondly, they are now the petitioners, essentially in a position, if they have second thoughts, of trying to reconcile and stay in. So with those two forces in mind, what is the negotiating? What is your negotiating posture, and where do you see this ending? What's your prediction?
Le pronostic est dur à faire.
It's hard to give a good prognostic.
Nous ne souhaitions pas le départ.
We didn't want the UK to leave,
Nous regrettons
and we're very sorry about the Brexit, first and foremost. But it is the British people's responsibility and decision, and we respect it. But to exit the EU, it means get out completely. You can't be,
à la carte.
picking and choosing.
Et donc,
And so it's a process that was put in place, and there's been a negotiator that was appointed
pour aboutir à deux étapes.
to arrive at two steps. First, withdrawal document or action, and then a process that will allow us to define how we're going to live after, with important issues, including security, but also the type of trade relationships will exist after with the UK, after the Brexit.
Et là,
And there, it goes back to the paradox that I illustrated before, because the European Union, 27 of them, they're united up to this day. They're in their collective actions and their will to withhold the great principles that have founded the European Union, and not to accept this picking and choosing. We could have thought that the actions of one or the other could have shaken up this unity.
même l'action
Even actions of other stakeholders that we may talk about later, who have the objective of deteriorate the functioning of the union, but that didn't happen. And so I don't see how it could happen.
et ce qui amène
And
d'ailleurs
what brings us to say that,
complexité
with the complexity of this withdrawal, it's very tempting for certain people to get out. They have really cooled down. So today, I think, we're looking at this divorce, and we're moving along, but Michel Barnier says we've done 85% of the work. There's the Ireland, the question of Ireland, that's not simple. How to ensure that Ireland, as a member state, remains in the UN, and that Northern Ireland is out without having a border, and respecting the accords of the Good Friday, which brought the pacification in Europe. So there's been a lot of progress, but it's still a very big question that is difficult to settle. And so you can't be in and out of the union, and you can't have advantages outside that you didn't have when you were inside. So there are 4 fundamental freedoms in the union: the freedom of movement of people, money and services, and you can't divide this. And we are facing this situation, and March 29 is an important date next year. It's a deadline, and I'm not sure of the outcome. And the worst thing would be that we don't agree on this divorce, because in that case it represents a catastrophe for the UK and a difficult situation for the Union, for the EU. Because March 29 to the 30th, I think, that night. So the big questions like how will the Eurostar conductor, he will have to have the authorization to come into the European territory. How's that going to happen that night? Does he not have the authority to pass? The plane that leaves London, does it have to have the authorization to come in, and how is it going to work? Because we have management of the European sky, so it becomes problematic.
Okay, listen, we've only been in Europe so far. I want to go to the audience, but it's a big world out there. Minister just came from Africa. There's China. There's Russia. There is the United States, which I was decorous enough as a host not to begin with. Any place is fair, provided it's a question. So a question has a certain inflection at the end and suggests that you are looking for what he says and not saying what you say. So subject to that rule and that rule only, the minister's got about 20 minutes to take questions, and he's got a hard stop because he's got other things he needs to do, and he and I need to run away and have a little lunch together and catch up. And here's what you do. You go up there, there's a microphone right up there, and you get up and you ask a question and keep it concise. This is Margot, who's a student of mine. Speak up a little bit, Margot.
Is that better? Great. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for being here this morning. As I said, the question I'd like to ask you about is Iran and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. In the context of the shifts and the evolutions that you've discussed so far this morning, how effectively do you think that France and other European nations can salvage the remnants of the deal and keep a multilateral framework in place?
Good question. Yep.
Concerning Iran, together with the Trump administration, we have a difference in methodology in terms of the Vienna Accord and nuclear accord as well. I will talk about it more in a second. That's your questions. But we do have, however, a united view on the risks and the threats that Iran represents. On other subjects, there are really 4 subjects where the relationship, where there's a conflict in opinion, accessibility or not of Iran to the nuclear armament, and we consider that the Vienna Accord settles this. But it's still a subject that we can discuss, and if Iran stays part of that accord. And the second subject is the missiles. So there's kind of a craziness there in terms of Iran, in terms of its production capacity and the way that it supplies armament to groups like the Hezbollah or Houthi. And there's a third subject, which is the destabilizing role of Iran in that zone, whether it be in Libya, Syria, Yemen, or elsewhere. And there's also a fourth subject, what happens to the nuclear accord after 2025. So those 5 subjects, really. One of them is settled. It's the non-accessibility of Iran to have the nuclear arm until 2025, the date where the accord ends. So why destroy it? Let's focus on the 3 other issues. Because this first commitment, it's validated by those who are in charge of doing the inspections. And there was a report by the International Agency on Atomic Energy that certifies this. And so let's push Iran to come and have discussions on the 3 other subjects. And we say, okay, let's not talk about this one because that's settled. So we have with the United States an important difference in terms of methodology. And in terms of the Americans, the American part, they think that by putting a lot of pressure and sanctions on Iran, that will lead to bring Iran to the negotiation table, but we disagree. Knowing Iran, we think that these types of intervention will, on the contrary, reinforce this issue and make sure that the Iranian people be even stronger. When we saw the very big difficulties in the past, but regardless, they stayed united and strong. So we want this accord to continue, and with other people who want to protect this accord, we're putting measures in place, technical and financially, to continue with this accord, and we're working with the UK, Germany, China, and Russia. But it is a point where we disagree, yeah. And
good question, Margot. I've got this gentleman, and then Carl Kaiser. Go ahead.
Thank you again for coming, Mr. Foreign Secretary. As you know, one of the central strategic changes in the U.S. approach to the Middle East, initiated in part by Secretary Carter, it was the U.S. pivot to Asia, a reduction in the U.S. role in the Middle East over a sustained period of time. And France, to some degree, has moved into that space. Succinctly, the U.S. role in the Middle East seems to be declining.
This guy's microphone doesn't look like it's on to me.
You have to speak louder.
Okay.
Yeah, pick it up.
Thanks very much. I'll try again. My apologies. I wanted you to ask your thoughts about the U.S. decision to essentially pivot to Asia, reduce its role in the Middle East, and the opportunities this creates for France to move in as a diplomatic player. And I'm wondering more broadly what your strategic vision is for France in the Middle East as the U.S. role is redefined. Do you see an opportunity for France? Do you see risks for France that you plan to manage over the next 5 to 10 years?
We have with the United States major points on which we are working together. And I think that we have to recognize or see the realities as they are. Concerning Syria, we were working together. So I don't have the impression that on Syria, which is a very big issue, that the U.S. are folding back onto themselves. And we had some meetings yesterday on that very topic, and we're working together against terrorism where it lies. Concerning Korea, our positions are very close as well. We consider that the progress that was made is positive. And also the non-proliferation is a very important question, and we have to continue to pressure North Korea to demilitarize that peninsula. So Mali, Africa, there are other points where we're fighting against terrorism and our views are in harmony. So there are very heavy subjects where we all agree. And we have a common position. So we do have a question mark and I think it has to be shared by many people, which is what is the American initiative concerning the Middle East? The peace process that's been relaunched. We've been waiting for that for a long time, and it should happen next month, and it's been several months. And now we learn that it's being pushed back again several months. So there is a sort of a question mark there on the conception of the U.S. Toward this Middle East crisis. The U.S. have a responsibility, a very important responsibility, and so they have to take the initiative. And if they don't, we will then, the goodwill stakeholders will have to take over, because you can't let this situation as it is. There's no status quo. The status quo was the non-initiative, and that was an answer already. And so there's a point where it's not going to hold. And I'm very concerned about this situation in Gaza and the risk that this represents. And at the same time, there's President Trump, I think, gave a few indications in his press conference on this topic. But yeah, we have to take action.
This gentleman here, then Carl, and then back here.
Thank you, Minister, for being here. I'm Philippe Lecourt, Kennedy School from Lorient. You addressed between the lines the issue of Asia, and as you know, here the Sino-American trade war is a big issue in the news and in political circles. I wonder if you see this conflictual relationship between the United States and China as a chance for Europe and for France in particular to interact in a different way with Asia and with China in particular. I'm thinking in particular of what's happening on the trade front.
So is the U.S. trade war with China good or bad for France?
I don't think it's a good thing. I think I mentioned it in my introduction. I think the good thing would be that we join together and reform the OMC rules, or the World Trade Organization. That is the organization that is in charge. And some countries, including the U.S. now, don't consider that this sphere is a good sphere for discussion, and so there's confrontation going on. It's a certain logic that leads to this conflicting situation between the U.S. and China, which have led to other conflictual situation between Europe and the U.S., who are now under discussion, but there's no result yet. And I'm just thinking about this. We have towards China ourselves, the Europeans, because the trade policy is led by the EU, not by each country individually. So we have toward China a lot of issues that we would like to be settled on access to market, transparency, copyright. And so if we look at the rules of the WTC, if we can work on this together, that would be a good thing. Up to now, it's not been the case. And the Chinese people also have to agree with this. And globally, I tried to say it, but it probably wasn't clear enough in my intro. There are two conceptions there as well in the way that we can manage the trade relations globally. I think that the U.S. are in a certain logic of adding more bilateral confrontations, thinking that by doing this, it becomes a whole, and we don't think so. We think that the global interest in growth of companies, trade, is not by creating conflictual bilateral situations, because it's more interesting for everybody to have global rules that will allow everybody to have an added benefit. So by having those relationship, it's a restriction to big issues. It would be a better idea to work together. That is a free trade with regulations. So for China, we have this same requirement. And a last observation, I'm sorry I spent a lot of time on China, but I talked about China earlier very lightly, but I will tell you a story, that something that happened to me. So in my region, at the end of Europe, the Chinese invested in a trade school. Good thing. And when the ambassador to China came, he said it's a good example for the Silk Road. And I'm a historian by trade, and I know that the Silk Road never went into that city, never. C'est très loin. And that's a very revealing that behind this concept of the Silk Road, it's really multilateralism in front, as a front, that is wanting to prepare a world order where President Xi, and he has settled the date is 2049. 2049, China will be the first power in the world, and that's 100 years after the Chinese Revolution in his mind, and that's the real topic. And so the only way to really stop this logic is to say we have international organization that we have to rethink on clear basis, so let's have a discussion. And the confrontation, in my opinion, will be defavorable to China, but on the midterm, unfavorable to the U.S. as well, and the other stakeholders.
Mr. Minister, I would like to ask you on the Ukraine issue, on your views. There seems to be a Western consensus still for the short and medium run that the Minsk process of negotiations should be used, that the sanctions should be maintained. But what are your views on the longer term? Should we continue to maintain the notion that the Ukraine should join NATO? Or should we, as Henry Kissinger proposed it, advance the notion that Ukraine, while being free to be a Western system and the Western economy, should be between the two, like Finland?
For the immediate, there is a process that you mentioned, the Minsk process, that has to try to progress. But I went to Ukraine several times, and I participated in the Minsk process, and it's not going anywhere. It's not progressing. On both sides, there are behaviors that are staying with the status quo, blocking. It's a simple process to implement, to make sure that there's a withdrawal of heavy weaponry beyond the conflictual line. And then we have to have an exchange of prisoners. You have to engage a political process to decentralize. Everything is written down, but every time we meet 4 people at the table, it lasts for a very long time, and we talk about the same subjects over and over again. So if there's no initiative, very strong initiative there, we're going to maintain the sanctions towards Russia. So this is a period important because there's our election in Ukraine next year, and the campaign is going to start very shortly. So we have very little time. We have to take advantage of this time. And I think Russia would have a good idea if it used this example to show how it's able to take peace initiatives that are useful, but Russia's not moving right now. So personally, I thought that, you know, with the football cup, that they could take this initiative and have Ukrainians face their responsibilities, but it hasn't done that. So maybe there's a certain will to keep a conflict alive for the long term. And so if this process doesn't doesn't progress, there is an idea at the last meeting, and I'm not sure if that's a good idea. At the last discussion in the process of Minsk, both parties said that it would be important to have a peace, UN peace mission in place. But that type of operation, it only happens when there is peace. So how can we keep peace with the UN when peace doesn't yet exist? So it's a bit of a trick, and they didn't themselves have a clear conception of the peace, maintaining peace. So they have different views on this type of operation. One has a much wider view of it than Ukraine has a wider view than Russia.
You've waited a long time. Let's do this. We're really out of time. Let's get a question here and a question here, and ask them, and you can pick or do both briefly, Jean-Yves, because I need to get you on to your next engagement. Go ahead.
My name is Francis. I'm the MPA student here. My question is the Europe, the refugee crisis create a lot of problem, both for social and for political. So what's your opinion on French government to taking the leading role in EU, especially for multilateralism, to solve the crisis?
Refugee crisis.
Non, j'ai fait les deux.
Go ahead, sorry.
Monsieur le ministre, je voulais revenir à vos
So I wanted to talk again about what you said, rethinking the international system to face pressures of certain great powers that cause a crisis, but this rethinking by to restructure it will require the Security Council. So how can you rethink the UN without the powers that agree that are causing problems for the EU today? I can see what the difficulty is. I said that we can, rethink multilateralism with three orientations, maintain the major elements of multilateralism that are suffering right now, to renovate them, like the WTC. And so for the UN, it's the same thing. We're thinking about this, how to rethink the EU. Some countries have, withdrawn themselves, but there's been modifications since the last war, and there's questions on the representation of each country. But we have to talk and find a compromise. But today, clearly, since the Trump administration doesn't consider that it's a good tool, and is removing itself from a certain number of actions, including peace operations. So clearly it's not a good tool, and China is preparing for the future, and there is pressure, and we have to find allies to find solutions, and there is the veto. And we're interested in that right as well. And so we have to make sure that the complementary initiatives happen also for the UN. We have to mobilize. And maybe one day the US will change their mind. But it's not for me to say, that's for you. In terms of immigration, I think that in Europe, there's not really a crisis of refugees in the sense of, like we've known in the past few years. We have known some much more important crisis in terms of refugees, but there's a crisis in politics. And there, the refugee policy is being used for internal issues, and Europe has to have a very clear position on this crisis. And there are principles, two main principles, and the question is how to implement them. But the European Council validated those two principles. One, those who are seeking asylum must be treated in such a way that we respect their rights. That's fundamental in Europe. So that person must be really seeking asylum, like a Syrian person that's trying to avoid war and massacre. He can ask for asylum, and all of the countries must take care of this, because this is a fundamental value, and it must be done jointly and quickly in order to assure their insertion. And secondly, the people who are seeking, or the regular immigrants, must be treated humanly but brought back to their country, which means strong relationship with those countries. Once those two principles are there and they're respected and they're fundamental, and sometimes people in the public debate only look at one of those two principles, those two aspects. There was some French intellectuals that wanted that all migrants would be able to come where they want, when they come, and that's not possible, because there are rules for regular migrants and people seeking asylum. It's not the same thing, and sometimes people just confuse the two voluntarily, to confuse the issues. So there has to be a migration policy that is trifold, with one, Europe that protects itself and the security of its borders, and at the same time Europe that can receive and treat properly those people seeking asylum, and also a Europe that can ensure that the starting countries be in an active partnership with Europe, so that those immigrants can be welcome. But irregular migrants, for the main part, they are not serving their own country, because it's the most active people, the better elements, that are leaving and that are bringing the creativity and innovation, and so they're depriving their own countries of all of that. So we're working on that with African countries. To implement this is not always simple, but these are the basic principles
So
of
ladies
the
and
EU.
gentlemen, we need to let the minister go now. Thank you, Jean-Yves. Well done. Thank you for your friendship of France and the United States. 242 years, ladies and gentlemen, 242 years. And it's not over yet, in my opinion. That's a prediction. I have no basis for guaranteeing that. Your and my friendship will continue. Thank you very much, Jean-Yves, for coming here.